Hi, and welcome to today's event on U.S. broadband. I'm Jessica Dine, a research assistant for broadband policy at ITIF. The digital divide, the gap between people who have broadband and people who don't, has been a central and growing source of harm for decades, and closing it is a universally agreed upon goal of communications policy, but it's also a source of contention, specifically over what it is, who's connected and who's not, and the best methods for closing it. The landscape has changed significantly since broadband first became a policy priority. Today, networks are much more widespread than they were 10 years ago, but there are still troubling gaps in adoption. As states ready themselves to receive unprecedented amounts of funding through last year's IIJA, as clear an understanding of the current landscape as possible and understanding of the most effective solutions to the divide will be an integral part of using the funding intelligently and productively. Today's event will be about an hour. The first part will be a discussion between panelists, and we'll try to leave some time at the end for audience questions. Audience members are encouraged to submit questions using the available Slido link. If you're watching on our website, you can find the link in the event summary. If you're watching on YouTube or on our social media, you can find the question link in the video description. I'm excited to have with me today some excellent panelists ready to discuss this important topic, so I'll introduce them now in no particular order. First, we have Sarah Olam, Senior Fellow at the Technology Policy Institute, where her area of focus includes law and economics and technology policy, and she's done some very interesting work on broadband mapping. Next, we have Rob Rubinovitz, Senior Vice President and Chief Economist at NCTA, the Internet and Television Association, where he analyzes and conducts economic research in support of relevant legislative and regulatory issues. Next, we have Nicole Turner-Lee, Senior Fellow at Brookings Institution and Director of the Center for Technology Innovation, who has done extensive work on broadband deployment and internet governance issues, including focus on equitable access to technologies. Next, we have Jonathan Chaplin, Managing Partner at New Street Research, an expert telecom analyst who has done some interesting work on the costs to close the digital divide. And finally, we have Nick Lidlam, Senior Vice President and Chief Communications Officer at CTIA, where he oversees work on national wireless issues such as spectrum and the deployment of next generation 5G networks. Thank you all so much for being here. Now, if we can jump right in. I was wondering, Sarah, if you might be able to start us off with the first question. Going back to basics, having good data is foundational to understanding the current state of US broadband. Could you maybe talk about any flaws that you know of with the common, most current approaches to measuring the broadband landscape, things like adoption and deployment, and maybe how those methods could be improved upon?
Sure. Thanks, Jessica and ITIF for having this panel. Yeah, I'd be glad to talk about broadband data. So at the Technology Policy Institute, we've been building a broadband map that has maps graphically, but has econometric tools on the back end. So the thing about broadband data is that you don't just want one data set. You want a combination of many different data sets to answer that question of where areas are unserved, where adoption is lagging, what demographics are in that area, what topography. There are just so many inputs that go into that question of where to send broadband funding. And so as economists, we've been working with these data sets a lot and realized, wow, it takes a lot of prep work to get these data sets into a statistical software and to answer that question, which is it's a very straightforward question. You know, what areas are unserved and should get stimulus money? And it's a question that all the states are asking of themselves and of their, people on the ground. And that's what the maps are supposed to help inform. But there's a lot of data analysis that needs to happen to really decide how to prioritize different parts of a particular area for getting funding, the trade-offs. And so that's why we have a tool that is a web app. You can go to our website and download data sets that layer all those inputs in one place. So happy to talk more. And I'm sure, any questions that come up, about how to really find those areas from the data. I think you asked a question too about how to improve data sets.
Yeah.
And so I think, every particular data set, is not perfect and can be better. And so you see like an iterative process, the challenge process with the fabric maps, and every like different edition of data sets are coming out. So really, you have to take into account error rates, but I think the harder question is combining all the data and analyzing it to have a good set of answers about where to fund broadband.
Thank you, Sarah. No, that's a very good point. Look, there are plenty of good data sets out there, but looking at any one data set in isolation without taking other factors into account is often either not that helpful or actually misleading, depending on what you're looking at. You need to try to look at all the factors in concert. And it's also good to have diverse input to figure out where data might be going wrong or missing things. Nick, I wonder if you might have anything to add?
Well, I think we all have an interest in making sure that we have highly accurate maps and making sure that the data is strong. I think we're going through a process right now on that. But I think the thing to remember is that we all have a shared goal, right? And that's why we're all here on this conversation, of making sure that everybody has access to reliable high-speed broadband, whether it's delivered through licensed spectrum wirelessly or through some other means. And I think if we start with that principle, we can all work together and make sure that the maps are accurate and deliver on the promise.
That's a good point, Nick. Thank you. Yeah, the shared goal should ideally be enough to get us there. How do you think the flaws or gaps that we've been talking about a little bit in the way we collect and assess broadband data in general are currently influencing or can influence broadband policy? Jonathan, I wonder if you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we sort of, we all heard the examples, the bad examples that came out of the ITIF process, where funding was provided to cows and chicken coops, to build broadband to cows and chicken coops and things that generally don't need broadband, as a function of bad mapping infrastructure. And so the outcome is, we waste money sending funding to the wrong places. We leave areas that should receive funding for broadband unfunded, and the sort of the collateral damage that comes from all of that is trust in the entire process. The sort of the credibility of closing the initiative to close the broadband divide gets undermined. Jessica, I want to go back to something you said earlier. So you mentioned that there are lots of great data sets out there. If there are a lot of great data sets out there, we haven't managed to put our finger on them. There, from our perspective, lots and lots of incomplete data sets, and an awful lot of work that's required to stitch together the truth from a lot of the inadequate pieces. And as an outsider, at least in terms of from the policy realm, I'm wondering why it's so difficult. The operators all know exactly what infrastructure they've got where. I'm not sure why we just don't collect the data on where broadband infrastructure is from the operators, and then figuring out where it isn't is just a much simpler undertaking, as opposed to the process that we're going through now, where we're building these enormous geolocation databases and integrating it with FCC data that's like a year and a half out of date, and trying to like feed into that speed test data, and like collecting this mosaic of 6 or 7 databases together to paint a picture where the truth is already known by somebody, and we can just collect the correct data from them.
That's a very good point, Jonathan. Thank you. Great may have been too strong a word. There are many serviceable data sets out there that are trying to measure something that looks helpful, but when it comes down to it, almost all of them need some form of analysis or adjusting. Rob, I wonder if you might have something to say.
Yeah, so thanks for having me. This is a great panel. Happy, honored to be part of this group. I guess just to pick up, I mean, I have a few things to say about this, but just to pick up first with Jonathan's comment. I mean, I think that is where we are now. The FCC's process is to collect data from the operators about where they are offering service. Some operators are doing it by shape files, and some of them are doing it address by address. But that is, I think basically what the FCC is trying to do now, and then match that to the fabric data, which is supposed to show where every broadband serviceable location is right now. And it's just, I mean, it's an impossible task really to get that right, to figure out, as you said, but the chicken coops and whatever. I mean, is that, if you look at a satellite photo, you see a structure, is that really where broadband's supposed to go? I mean, so it's not surprising that there are been hiccups and probably continue to be, but we're certainly, our members are trying hard to provide as accurate data as possible and working with the FCC to update that information. And more locations have been added already between the first version of the fabric and the second version of the fabric, as part of this process of trying to improve the data. I guess a couple other things I wanted to say are just that, in addition to how the data are collected, which I think is kind of what Jonathan was talking about and what I was trying to follow up on, there's issues about how the data are used. I mean, one thing we haven't talked about yet is speed test data. First of all, there's a lot of issues that we think with how a lot of speed test data is collected. There are a lot of sort of confounding factors in terms of, people's, quality of modems and locations of modems in their homes. And there's Microsoft speed test data that really is just based on, people downloading software, which is clearly not necessarily reflective of what capability their networks have. And then I think that the speed test data is used, conflates questions of what people have decided to purchase and adopt versus what actually is available. And available is really, seems to be the question here if we're trying to figure out where the gaps are. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. And then I guess finally, it's important, I think, to have apples to apples comparisons when you're looking at data. I think, this comes up a lot in sort of US versus European comparisons, particularly like pricing, because, you have to control for so many different things when you're comparing a price, quality, cost, demand factors, all of that. I think that's often overlooked. And then I guess it's just also, maybe somewhat going back to Jonathan's comment, there's just, there's a timeliness issue. A lot of this is government data. The government, is not always as funded as it could be, and it, doesn't have the resources to collect the data. So some of it does end up being out of date. Adoption data from the census is kind of the best source, I think, that's out there, but that's 2021 is the most recent data that's available. So, it's just kind of the nature of the beast, I think, when you're working with government data.
You actually bring up a very good point, Rob. Thank you. I'd like to ask, and I'd actually like to put this to any of you, how much should we rely on data? Because as we've been, it's very hard it's almost impossible to get comprehensive, perfect data. That's essentially never going to happen. And even if we did manage to arrive at that perfect data, the broadband ecosystem isn't stagnant. So it's going to pretty quickly become out of date. So from a policy perspective, how should we look at data? Like, what role should it play?
So I guess I'll jump in. I mean, first and foremost, I think these conversations that we're having are interesting because we've had these conversations for decades. I'm not going to age myself, but this is a conversation we've had more than 20 years ago when it came to collecting broadband data and which variables should be inputted, like Sarah was talking about, and which variables have more weight over the others. I know Jonathan's been looking at this for a long time as well, in his previous capacities before he even went to New Street, if you remember. I mean, I think the challenge today is that we not only need the data, we need the data because we have a whole lot of money. And when we have a whole lot of money, the question becomes, where are you putting this money? And are you going to have impact? And what are the metrics for measuring whether or not an area that was unserved or underserved is actually suited to have the type of broadband speed to do things that we're doing right now? I think what we're seeing in all the data is that we're repurposing data that was insufficient years ago, and it still remains insufficient now. I also think that we're not looking at data that has, as Sarah said, the right inputs. When I look at broadband research and I look at closing the digital divide, right now, the quagmire that we're all in is really the people who are not only sufficiently underserved, but they live in areas, unfortunately, that are surrounded by those cows and goats. They are in areas that we actually need to know where people are not actually getting service And in many respects, they're in areas where we need to have contiguous service. So we need all of the data so we can create a true interstate highway when it comes to getting broadband access from point A to point B. So I do think that we have to revisit this conversation over and over again. And I think it's a worthy exercise to not just involve government data, but to find ways in which academics and private sector can piece together data that's publicly available and potentially come up with a much stronger data set that includes some commonalities when it comes to inputs and outputs. I don't think we need everything, but clearly I think we need to really make an attempt to really clean out our national database. I think another area that's often overlooked in these conversations too, we talk about data infrastructure, is the extent to which we can have regional and state data. I think we spend a lot of time on creating the perfect national map, when in actuality, we need to maybe create corridors. How are we doing regionally in certain corridors when we start to overlay the various data sets? Do we see insufficiencies when it comes to connectivity so that we can overlay hybrid models of technological inputs and technological access? At the end of the day, again, getting to a perfect map is like me getting to a perfect day. It's just not going to happen, right? But we can find ways to create, I think, either, examples of where there's regional strength that we all know has outputs of economic development, better educational literacy, healthcare outcomes. And we can find ways to even go hyper-local with more granular data. We just published a report, for example, on how rural African Americans and Latinos use the internet. We went hyper-local with a sample of about 2,500 people that lived in the far trenches of the deep South. And they were also people of color. And what we actually found out is that they are actually being missed in any of these data sets that we're talking about, because they live in areas where they're very much marginalized from any type of facility to get the adequate broadband access. In fact, many of those people are still on DSL. That's how devastating it was in terms of their access. My point is, I think we have to think about this grandiose exercise that we're in and think about how it's going to either help or restrict the type of outputs that we want with this investment of money.
That's a great point, Nicole. Thank you. This is kind of an all hands on deck type of endeavor. And I think especially as we're talking about adoption, it's critical. You need data at every level for everything. But when we're talking about adoption, the more granular and the more local you can get, the more helpful the results will be, because so many different demographic and just county level and town level factors play into adoption rates. It's way too complex to have one countrywide overview there. I wonder if we could now move on and say we're in some imaginary world where we do have great data and it's very useful. Looking at that data, what kind of results do you think we would need to be seeing right now to have a sort of general consensus that US broadband is doing well, or at least that it's on the right track? Sarah, I wonder if you could, thank you.
Sure. One thing, to respond also to Nicole, we've been doing this for decades now, and so the last time there was a big broadband stimulus bill was the Recovery Act of 2009. And one critique about the whole system is, money goes out from the government in broadband stimulus, but we don't track where it's going very well. We really don't know outcomes from the last round. And I don't see many efforts in mandating that we collect data from this round from the grantees that received money. So I think it's easy to spend the money to be concerned about where it goes, but after it's out the door, not as much attention is paid to evaluation, tracking, really measuring. Did the ways that the money was distributed, was it effective? How could it be improved? All that effort on the back end or on the after effects is just lost. It's missed. So I really recommend that people working on this round of IIJA and BEAD funding put in that requirement to collect data from the grantees and to really report results 5 years out, 10 years out. We really don't, I really haven't seen much out of the BTOP program. And I was looking for data for that. So I just recommend because it's going to happen again. And same with the USF program and all the money that's spent. The attention is placed on spending it, but we really don't learn that much after the fact. And so I think that needs to happen.
if I could jump in, Jessica, just on what Sarah's talking
absolutely.
about. So recently, and we have a piece coming out on this as well, Brookings, been talking about like a broadband dashboard, right? So something that is in real time, because we have a lot of urgency around this span as well. And there's money actually being allocated. So, I mean, I think the other thing when it comes to data, particularly for researchers like ourselves, is the extent to which we're able to track this money in a very, effective way, right? Because money is coming out pretty much every day. It's coming out from, 4 agencies, really, like the FCC, NTIA, Treasury, and USDA. So I think one way to sort of increase public transparency about the spending is through some type of dashboard that begins to show you where those investments are being made, what localities, what regions, what states, and the extent to which, as we've been talking about just the improvement of data infrastructure, who's involved with some of these decisions. I think many of us are seeing states put together councils, but on the back end, we're also hearing, I didn't know this was going on in my state, right? And so part of the other question is who's at the table? And perhaps some of these dashboards could indicate that participatory process in addition to how the money's being spent, particularly as we lean into where we're going to have some accountability on the larger allotments of spending. So just something to think about. I think part of the challenge that we're all having is that we think it's a linear process. And in actuality, it's not as linear as we think. And I think all of us can recognize that after COVID, that life was not linear and life will never continue to be linear. But the challenge is to make the case that this is a continued and expansive investment that is going to have, as Sarah said, outcomes. Having some type of dashboard, I think, really matters.
That's a great. Sorry, please go ahead.
Oh yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that as a practical matter, it's quite difficult. We have been trying internally to track where all this money, the money that's been given out so far, where it's going, who's getting it, and each state is doing it differently. Each county is doing it differently. I mean, I think it unfortunately kind of calls for a more uniform, maybe top-down approach so that everybody's collecting the data in the same way. I think that was a problem with BTOP too, is that there wasn't any uniformity imposed on how that information was being kept. And I guess to go back to your question, Jessica, about how we might assess whether we're going in there. I mean, I think, again, I think being able to look at data over time, obviously, I mean, maybe just an obvious point, is important to figure out whether we're going in the right direction. And again, I think that calls for sort of uniform data sets. I think it's going to be difficult if every state is doing it differently. And we're trying to compare, again, apples to oranges, when one state's doing it one way and a different state's doing it another way. So, I think those are all the challenges that we're kind of faced with right now.
That's a very good point. And it is tricky because on one hand, we want data that's as local and granular as possible, wherever possible. But also, the more uniform top-down the approach is, maybe the more uniform the data itself will be and the more readable it'll be. So there are just a lot of balls in the air. I wonder if we could move on a little. There has been a lot of discussion so far about served and unserved. And as we all know, a segment of the population has a mobile connection, but they don't have a fixed one. So when we're trying to define served and when we're trying to count adoption rates, which technologies do you think should count as broadband? Do you think maybe recent technologies are changing the game? Nick, I'll throw that to you first.
Well, yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, the fastest growing home broadband solution in the country by a wide margin is 5G home broadband, delivered by licensed spectrum and competing really effectively with various other solutions. In fact, the numbers are really, really overwhelming. I think, going back just for a half step to the conversation about mapping and data and so on, all of these conversations and all the data in the world isn't a substitute for good old-fashioned common sense, and the two kind of go hand in hand. And so when I think about the question, that you just asked, what's broadband and what's not, I think, well, let's look at it from a user perspective. At the height of the pandemic, when we were shut down and we all had to do these things, we didn't have much of an option. For something like 40 megabits down and 5 up, a family of 4, a family of 5 could do pretty much everything that they needed to do. They could, both parents could work from home remotely, kids could participate in school or video game or do whatever it is that they wanted to do. So, I think looked at from that perspective, there's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all approach to delivering broadband. There's not one solution. There's a multitude of great, compelling solutions that can help get people online, can keep them online consistently with great service, and I think that's really got to be the starting point.
That's a great point, Nick. Thank you, Jonathan. I wonder if you might have something to contribute.
Yeah, I think there's a danger in technology neutrality when we're talking about putting a lot of money into building infrastructure. And I think there's a danger in focusing on the speeds that households need today. The infrastructure that we're looking to fund has a life of at least 20 years and maybe double that. And so we really want to take a very long-term view on the kind of infrastructure that we're investing in, and a very long-term view on how user needs might evolve over 20 to 40 years. From that perspective, I think the key requirement is the infrastructure that we should be investing in for the future is infrastructure that is scalable and upgradable to speeds that go well beyond the capabilities or the needs of sort of the average household, what somebody thinks the average household needs today. And it's I have a sort of a strong bias in thinking that we should just be funding one thing, which is fiber, unless there's absolutely no way to make fiber work in a specific geography. And everything else that we put money into is ultimately going to be a dead end that we're going to have to go back and redo at some point in the next 5 to 10 years. I think wireless technology in particular has phenomenal utility. We pay 40 times more for a bit of data going over a wireless network than we do for a bit of data going over a fixed network. And households are happy to pay that amount because of the utility that's built into being able to get a signal pretty much anywhere you are. But we have to recognize the fundamental limits, that just the flat out physical limits of those networks in terms of the amount of traffic they can carry. Wireless networks today carry 4 or 5% of the total traffic that is that's traversing the internet. If you were to double the amount of traffic on a wireless, on wireless networks in aggregate, you'd bring them to their knees. They'd be completely unusable. And so, in thinking about the infrastructure that carries 95% of traffic today, we've really got to be looking at scalable solutions that are going to work 20 years from now.
That's interesting.
Sorry, just to add to that. So this, pinning broadband to a speed of like 50 megabits per second, 100 megabits per second, 100 up, 20 down. I think it's all pointless, because whatever you pin that speed to today from a policy matter, but by the time we've deployed the infrastructure to deliver those speeds, it's going to be the wrong speed. We really want to look at the upgradability of everything that we're backing.
Thank you. That is an interesting point, Rob. It looked like you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, thanks. So I certainly agree with the scalability point. I guess I would disagree a bit with the favoring fiber over anything else. I think and I know Jonathan made the qualifier that there's certain situations where it's just not going to be economical, and I appreciate that. But I don't know that fiber is proven to be, people always talk about future-proof technologies. I don't know that fiber is proven to be that future-proof technology. The fiber that's been put in the ground by some of the telecoms has needed to be upgraded already. So I think they will continue to need to do that. I think that the goal, as we've discussed, is to try to get broadband to as many people as possible. So I think that you have to think in terms of what's going to be cost efficient. I certainly agree that the picking a specific test of 120 or whatever maybe is a fool's errand. But I do think you need to look at what people, to echo Nick's point, what they're using it for, and now, and what speeds are necessary for the activities they're doing now. And again, I think one of the things that points to is people's needs are very asymmetric still. The downstream speeds are much more important than upstream. And certainly that's asymmetric is a selling point for fiber, but I don't know that that's necessarily something we need to be focusing on, because people really still seem to have very asymmetric needs when it comes to their use of broadband. So I think that's something important to keep in mind as well.
That's a good point, Rob. Thank you. And also, as we're working with enormous but finite resources, and every policy decision is a trade-off. So the more you narrow down on a particular technology or anything like that, the more you might potentially be raising the cost of actually closing the divide. But there are just a lot of considerations here. Nicole, I wonder if you might have something to add. Sorry, Nicole, you're muted.
Okay, I thought it was my background noise was me. So I think what Jonathan is saying is interesting, because I think it does have a cost-benefit analysis of whether or not you want to sort of spread the network too thin where you put your investments and around the technology. But I don't agree with the fact that we should favor fiber, for one, because I think it's unrealistic. But I also think that the technology neutrality piece has some preference for me in my research, because there are going to be areas that is harder to serve. And we're going to require more of a hybrid approach to how we get connectivity to them. Fiber is not always going to be the solution in areas which might be small swaths of propagation. We actually may have to overlay different technologies to make it work. I think at the end of the day, I agree with you that we should be looking at this in terms of where is the upgradable capacity, but that's what got us here in the first place. That we were too reliant upon the marketplace to determine where we build broadband networks. I think at the end of the day, this is about consumer choice and the embodiment of where consumers can competitively engage. And if we run the risk of sort of thinking about upgradable capacity, I don't know about you, it differentiates between having a Mercedes S-Class version and a Mercedes other class version versus having some kind of uniformity when it comes to presenting some kind of standard speed so we know people can engage in things like this. I mean, at the end of the day, what I find to be so interesting about this conversation in the BEAD and what we're doing at the IIJA is we're sort of repeating history, right? Because we haven't really broken the logjam. The reason that we're doing this is because the digital economy demands that citizens and residents participate in the digital democracy in the way that it's been shaped. So I think at the end of the day, it's more important for us to sort of think about, I like the conversation about trade-offs that Rob just talked about, where are there trade-offs, but most importantly, where can we think creatively so that we don't bind ourselves into sticking to one technology that doesn't canvas the people that we're really trying to reach? Because right now they're not near anything. So we really got to think about this in our facilities approach going forward. And, wireless coupled with something else may not be a bad idea.
Thank you, Nicole. Nick, I wonder if you might want to jump in.
A couple of quick points, and I echo some of what Rob and Nicole just said, but three quick things. The first I would say is the BEAD program provides something like $42 billion a year. I think it's worth putting that in context. Last year, wireless providers, let alone all the other providers that we're talking about that are represented on this call, wireless providers invested $35 billion just to maintain and upgrade their networks. They do that every single year. So $42 billion in that context, well, actually, that's not going to go that far if we're not really smart and careful about it. And if we don't, really pay attention to those, as Nicole was just saying, who have a real need today. The other point that I think is worth making is that wireless is highly upgradable, right? With more licensed spectrum, we can expand these networks, we can enhance them. We have a very real example of just over the past year, C-band spectrum coming online and improving speeds in those areas where it was turned on 50%. So there is a tremendous amount of capacity improvement that can be done there, and tremendous opportunity to serve. And then coming back to the prior point, as we do have limited funds. If we use those funds effectively, if we use them in a way that brings the greatest need to the most people now, that also frees up money and resources for things like digital literacy and promoting adoption and those sorts of things, right? So at the end of the day, this is about making sure people get connected. There are a lot of paths there. They're going to be different community to community. They're going to be different state to state. And we need to be smart and careful and thoughtful about all of that.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you to all of you. This is a very interesting discussion, and if nothing else, we've established that there's a lot of room for disagreement on this topic. But details aside, there is a digital divide, so I'd like to move on specifically to that right now. Sarah, I wonder if you could talk about what you think is the main driving force behind the continued digital divide. Is it a deployment problem for any audience members where the networks are, or adoption, whether households are subscribing to a network?
Yeah, so the digital divide, I mean, going back to my theme before, like we should be learning from our past experiments or funding. We have a really good experiment right now in the ACP and the EBB programs, getting people online with the voucher program, that digital divide program, which is like I guess a lifeline type program. I would love to see more research coming out of that, finding out what's working, what isn't. And that really is like, isn't that the end goal, to improve the programs, to find out what worked, what didn't, and for the next round to be better? I think, yeah, like 10 years ago, if you would have told the policy community we're going to spend $100 billion on broadband because the last billion, few billion didn't work, you'd say like, well, is that shouldn't that be enough to connect everyone to 25.3? And then hopefully in 10 years from now, we won't need to spend another $100 billion because this $100 billion didn't fulfill its goals. So I think the point is, like, we should be learning at every step. And like, what do we know about the digital divide? Well, we need to track the programs that have been focused on it.
That's a great point, Sarah. Thank you. Jonathan, I wonder if you might have something to add here.
Yeah, I strongly agree with Sarah. I think we've put a lot of resources into ACP and EBB, and the operators have put a lot of resources into their own programs for serving low-income households. And there really is a lack of information on how those programs have been used, and to what extent they've helped bridge the affordability gap, and how much of an, where adoption's still lacking, what elements of the affordability gap have they failed to serve. I want to go back to something else from the last conversation though as well, which is, I think you're all wrong. I think you're all giving up way too soon. I think $42.5 billion plus what's coming out of the States is absolutely enough to get fiber to virtually every one of 14 million unserved households today. You don't need to make the compromises and the trade-offs that you think you need to make. We've looked at households up to a cost of, I think, $60,000 to serve a single household in the data set that we've looked at. And there are undoubtedly, a handful of households that we're missing here and there where the cost might be in the millions, where it really doesn't make sense to serve with fiber. But the instances where that's the case is tiny in the context of what we're talking about here. If we had $20 billion to spend and we really had to make hard choices, I think all of the arguments that you're making would be valid. And in a realm of hard choices, you really have to compromise on what you're delivering to households. But we've got enough resources here where we don't have to make the compromise. And the point I would make is, if you solve the problem with inadequate infrastructure, we're going to be talking about the digital divide in 5 years from now, because we will have closed the digital divide for an instant with infrastructure that's inadequate, and we'll be right back to the same problem as Mark Zuckerberg delivers the metaverse and everybody's bandwidth needs go up by a factor of 10, and again, we'll be at a point where like 5-10% of the country is shut out of the utility and the capabilities that the other 90-95% have, because we've deployed inadequate infrastructure.
Right.
Sorry to drag us back to an old
topic.
Oh,
no, it's okay. Look, I'm
on this.
Right. Well, Jonathan, I'm gonna jump in, and you and I have talked about this. Listen, I do think that we have a lot of resources flowing in the ecosystem right now to close the digital divide for good. If we actually piece all that money together to do the fiber deployments in particular, yeah, we probably could, with all the agencies that are receiving money and the money that's being repurposed towards high cost areas. But this is a challenge. The digital divide is just not about bytes and bits and networks, right? It's about people, right? And that's the thing that I think we sometimes miss. When we look at the BEAD program, we're not servicing our community and local infrastructure unless there's money left over. We're not servicing digital literacy programs in a sufficient manner unless there's money left over. We've given nominal resources to the areas that matter most because we think if we continue to build it, that people will come. The people who already came to the party are already there. They got a drink in their hand. They've actually had about 2 or 3. They're doing a lot of stuff. But the people that we're worried about, and this is, again, a shameless plug for my book that will be out in the fall. We're not worried about the people with the glasses in their hand. We're worried about the people who in some way cannot contribute to the competitiveness of this country because they're not connected. And I think it's important for us to keep thinking that through in terms of the problem that we're trying to solve. If we continue to sort of think about, again, the marketplace of broadband deployment as the end goal, if we even continue to think about households as the end unit, we're going to miss the mark and we're going to be back here again. In the pandemic, there were churches, schools, community centers that didn't have adequate and sufficient broadband, housing units. And part of the problem was when 50 million school-age kids were sent home, many of those kids who were poor went back to some of those communities and sat in their homes because they couldn't even access the type of architecture that they needed in terms of open Wi-Fi, right? In some instances, just because they didn't live in communities where there was a lot of penetration, or they lived near Starbucks or someplace else. A lot of those kids sat on the stoops of churches and schools and other community-based organizations that they themselves did not have access to broadband. I'm a huge fan of this concept that Comcast is actually putting out there in terms of lift zones. And I've been watching it really carefully because it does provide an opportunity to rethink and unpack what we think of broadband to the home or to the household is. There are going to be cases where we have to do things differently. So I just share that because I do know, and in my conversations with folks, that perhaps we're thinking about this allocation and even the trend of the money to close the divide in order that's prioritized, things when really it should be we should be coalescing a lot of these goals, and allowing states to have the right stakeholders at the table to help them solve some of these problems. When it comes down to it, people are going to find ways to be connected. The challenge that we're dealing with is whether or not they have a few options for their gateway into that connectivity versus whether or not it's going to be one technology. So I just want to put that because I do agree with you, Jonathan, that we probably have enough sufficient resources to actually connect people and households. But I just think that we're not going to have sufficient resources if we build that highway, that people are going to have the needed resources to actually get on it. And that's where I stand in my space of closing the divide. It's no longer about the simplistic paradigms that we've actually put together. It's really about thinking through this problem differently.
Thank you, Nicole. And you bring up a very good point and a topic that I'd actually like to turn to now. On the adoption side, it's not as simple as building a network and people coming. There's a lot more complexity than that. Rob, I wonder if you could talk a little about, on the policy side, what adoption policies you think are most helpful in getting people to subscribe?
Sure. And just before I answer that, I just wanted to say that, the FCC is, going back to the ACP and what data is available, the FCC is in the process of, collecting more information from the providers about ACP, and we've been working with them to, make sure we can get them what they need so that we can evaluate that program. I think that is important. So I, to get adoption, obviously you need the networks to be available, and we've been talking a lot about that point. It needs to be affordable, and the ACP is going to that point. The programs that our companies have for low-income consumers are going to that point. We've provided evidence that middle class households, that broadband is affordable. Prices have been going down over time. what people spend on broadband is, less than 2% of their income, generally speaking, and for middle class people. And so again, that's an indicator of affordability. But at the end of the day, there's also a lot of evidence that says people don't feel like they need internet. I mean, the people who don't have it feel like they don't need it. And, so I think there's a big education component there. Call it digital literacy, whatever, I'm sure there are different names for it. But I do think it's important for people to understand who don't maybe understand what the benefits are of using broadband, despite the fact we think everybody needs it and it's crucial and all that. There are clearly people who don't get that yet, and so I think we need to devote resources to that. And and the BEAD program does, assuming there is money left over, and it will vary by state presumably, but if there's money that can be devoted to adoption programs, in addition to getting networks out to everybody, that BEAD allows for that. And so I think states need to keep that in mind.
That's a great point, Rob. Thank you. Sarah, I wonder if you'd like to jump in?
Yeah, could you repeat
that? Yeah. We're talking about just in general on the adoption side, what types of policies are maybe best in getting people online, since as we've discussed, it's not really as simple. Of course, deployment is the first step. Everybody needs a network that they can access. But after that, there are still some either barriers or choices that people make that lead to them not getting online. So just what policies can fit in there?
Sure. Well, I can go back to the data point that we started with. So the ACS data is subscription data collected by the Census Bureau. And that's pretty much what we know about adoption. And there are studies that have looked at, the correlations or the causation of access on adoption or on other factors on adoption, like income or rural or urban locations. So I think it's still an open question. Like there's no real answer yet on, what can help people adopt broadband. And so the adoption question it's not that related to access, because access is available for a lot of people who just aren't adopting. And now that we have ACP and EBB, it's not price because, it's pretty much free. Maybe it's the, frictions or the literacy part. Like, even though it's free, they don't know how to get to that program. And so there have been, proposals about, well, wrap it up in with SNAP or food stamps, or put it in other vehicles for connecting people to these programs. It's too hard to find, why are these programs coming out of like the FCC? Should they be connected with other social services? And then like Nicole said, like going through the school system. So E-rate, there are a lot of ways that E-rate can be tweaked and improved. So much money goes through E-rate and like a lot of, while there are schools and churches and community anchor institutions that aren't connected, there's some schools that are very connected. They have millions of dollars, put into the school system for broadband, but then is it being used well? So I think there's a lot of room for improvement and evaluation of current programs, especially for the adoption question.
So I have to jump in. I'm sorry. So I have to disagree with Sarah. I do think that adoption and accessibility and outcome related, what people do, are interrelated. I don't think that I think that we have high rates of penetration in communities, but I do think we have a couple of problems right now. First and foremost, we have a redundancy problem because we have a lifeline program and we have an affordable broadband program. And at some point, we need to revisit our universal service program, in particular for how we provision support to families who are eligible in a way that is conjoined, because I think we do have some fraction there. And then alongside that friction, we also have a universal service fund that is stressing out the very few providers that contribute to it. So that's a whole nother panel and a whole nother conversation I'm willing to have. But I think it's hard to sit there and say that adoption today looks very much like it did 20 years ago. that there are people who sit on the wrong side of poverty, who sit on the wrong side of literacy, who sit on the wrong side of food security, of housing, and a host of other areas. And they do not have access because they may be transient in housing, they may be transient in income, they may not have the internet-enabled device or the affordability. And thankfully, we as a country recognize that need, and through the emergency broadband benefit now to the affordability program, the ACP, we've been able to make those adjustments. The key thing is the same way that we care for people who have issues paying for the utility bills, whether or not this is going to be a segment of our society that we care about, and that's going to be long-term. And that's still a question that is out there. But we're also learning about this infrastructure that is locally driven, that there are other challenges. And that goes back to my earlier point. I'll stop here. Why we cannot be so determinist about one type of technology or one type of program, because people are living realities that do not look like what we as policymakers and telecommunications provider look like. And so I think, again, it's incumbent upon NTIA to provide some central intelligence to this conversation in some way or form, and for us to have the, and I think Rob said it earlier, to have the participation of the various agencies responsible for this alongside other actors, right? In some way where we can get a good handle on this, because we're 2 years in, and we have this urgency to actually get this money out here. But having been a top participant, a B-top participant, and now a policymaker watching IIJA, it's very apparent that there's some parts of the rule book that we're still following, even though the technology and the environment in which the technology is deployed has changed.
That's a great point, Nicole. Thank you.
Just one quick thing I wanted to throw out, just because we're saying, you know, ACP is an important part of the equation here, and it is, but the money is finite for that program as well, and it's not too soon to start thinking about what comes next. So
that's why a conversation on Universal Service Lifeline. You know, we got two different competing interests here. And Sarah, to your point, some people know about Lifeline, they don't know about this. So it's a really interesting dynamic that we've set up, where we do need to, going back to our earlier conversation, have some uniformity around data.
We're running a little short on time here, so I think one more question, and then I'd like to turn to some audience questions. And now this is for any of you. As we're talking about adoption, this has come up a few times, how do you think the United States is doing in terms of digital literacy? Do we have the programs that we need? Do we compare well to other countries? Are we ahead, behind? Just what does the landscape look like there? Nicole, maybe you have a thought?
I know I already spoke. I was trying to exercise constraint. You know, this is an area that I've kind of always in. So I think we have some traction when it comes to digital literacy. I think what's changed over the years is obviously the technology has got much more sophisticated. So we are seeing a lot more accessibility programs when it comes to digital literacy. We are seeing, you know, programs that are for seniors, you know, ARP alongside other aging organizations are doing great jobs there. We're seeing a lot more contextualization of digital literacy when it comes to employment and education. Again, the challenge is digital literacy tends to be on the fringes of some of the larger investments, which is my point, Jonathan, earlier. So the way in which we contextualize digital literacy to make more sense to people is actually something I think we should be thinking ahead of. We also have this other challenge, and we didn't talk about it here because of the sake of time. We've been looking at Brookings digital literacy from the standpoint of how it translates into workforce. There are a lot of jobs that are opening up as a result of this infrastructure, but yet we have a mismatch in those folks that are able to take these jobs. So I think we also need to rethink digital literacy, that it's not just about teaching people how to, you know, back in the days, I taught people on Microsoft Word, right? Because they didn't have Office capability. Today, we need to teach people on some of these lucrative positions that pay very well, so that, again, we can leverage some of those investments towards more sustainable employment.
That's a great point, Nicole. Thank you. I've been looking into digital literacy a little, and one of the first problems I found was that it's not, there are many definitions, but it's not consistently defined and defined. Right. Yeah. And from a policy perspective, if you don't know what you're trying to do, it's hard to do it. We have a few minutes left. I'd actually like to turn to one audience question now. What issue, and this is for anybody who'd like to answer, what issues might show up at a state level, given the fairly diverse approach to how some states are allocating funds?
Can you say that one more time, Jessica?
Of course. I'm sorry. This is going all the way back, I guess, to the BEAD funding. What issues might show up at a state level, given the fairly diverse approach to how some states are allocating funds? So because like we don't have perfect uniformity, which is what might be helpful here.
Well,
Yeah,
I guess I'd just say maybe quickly that at least if we're talking about BEAD, I mean, right. NTIA has put out, sort of criterion by which, states are supposed to decide how the money is going to be spent. And so there is, some uniformity that's trying to be imposed on at least that system. I think what's important is that the NTIA also put out a lot of requirements that seem unnecessary and, are really considered to be, voluntary things for the states to think about. And so it's important for, open access networks, for example. I know NTIA has talked about that. That's really wasn't in the statute. Probably not something states really have to be required to do to get the funding. So I think, states need to make sure they're focusing on the key things, the important things. But yeah, I mean, BEAD does have, certain requirements for states to follow.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think I would have liked to have seen a list of requirements out of NTIA that was a lot more prescriptive than ultimately what was put out, and also focused on the one thing that I think a lot of people have raised on this call, which is putting together sort of a policy approach that's going to ensure that we get the best possible infrastructure to the most possible homes, which really requires using every dollar, every one of the $42.5 billion in the most efficient way possible. I don't think there was enough regard in the rules put out to the states to really drive the importance of efficiency. I think another element that's required in order for all of that money to get to the last of 14 million unserved homes is for the states to put in place mechanisms that are going to pull in private capital. $42.5 billion isn't enough to get to 14 million homes on its own. But if it's allocated in the right way, and there's a lot of private capital married with it, then it absolutely can get to every one of 14 million unserved homes. And so I worry that with the sort of guidelines that were put out that really weren't prescriptive enough, that were sort of too vague in some areas, that sort of include things like a preference for open access networks, that we're going to end up with variability in how the funds are deployed across states. Some states are going to do it much better than others, and where we could end up with some states just missing the opportunity this historic opportunity to close the digital divide once and for all.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, like, I know that there's some requirement on the states for at least the digital literacy side of it for equity plans. I think that should have been an overall requirement in terms of being prescriptive as to how this was going to get at some of the hyperlocal concerns we're talking about today. Because I've heard some mismatch, like Rob mentioned, among states in terms of what their pressure points are and where they're investing. But I, again, think that without some type of equity plan on both the side of where we're serving and in addition to how we're engaging minority and women diverse suppliers in some of these programs, I think we won't see the type of economic outputs that will result from the investment in broadband, as opposed to just wiring, creating the network itself.
Thank you, Nicole. That's a great point. Now, this is a topic that could feed endless discussion, but we're pretty much at time, so I think that's going to be it for today. Because there's so much room for disagreement, we're probably unlikely to answer any of these questions once and for all. And of course, like we discussed, the broadband ecosystem isn't stagnant, far from it. So even when we figure anything out, if that happens, most of the knowledge that we gather becomes outdated pretty quickly. But I think the key here is to have an iterative process of discussions like this one that we had today, and hopefully each time hone in a little more narrowly on what the problem areas are and how to fix them. I want to thank the excellent panelists here for a great discussion. I hope to speak to you all again. For more events like this, please feel free to subscribe to itif.org. Thank you all and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jessica.
Thank you.